Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Justice in All Black. I'm your host for today, Crystal Eddins, and I'm joined by our guest, Professor Julia Jordan-Zachary, Chair of the Africana Studies Department here at UNC Charlotte. Welcome to Justice in All Black, Julia. How are you?
I am well. It is truly a pleasure to be here, and thank you for allowing me to participate in Justice in All Black.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you. Dr. Jordan-Zachary, or Dr. JZ as she is affectionately known, is the author of Black Women, Cultural Images and Social Policy, and the more recent book, Shadow Bodies, Black Women, Ideology, Representation, and Politics. She is the co-editor of Black Girl Magic Beyond the Hashtag, 21st Century Acts of Self-Definition, along with several other volumes. And she also serves as the president of the Association for Ethnic Studies. Dr. Jordan-Zachary's research and teaching interests deal with Black feminist thought, race, gender, and public policy, and Black women in healing practices. So I just think that it's such a fortuitous time to have you here as an expert on Black women in politics, especially considering everything that is happening socially and politically within these recent months. So let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to develop an interest in Black women in politics?
Okay. So my interest in Black women in politics probably started before I even knew the word politics or that there was a field such as Black women in politics. I was having a recent conversation with my college-age daughter, and she's telling me about all the courses she's taken around Black women. And I said to her, I did my undergraduate, my master's, and my PhD, and I never had a class on Black women in politics. Never formally had any type of class. So she looked at me and she said, how did you get here? And I smiled and I said to her, well, it has a lot to do with your grandparents. And I remember as a little girl, I used to travel with my mother across the island of Barbados, which is where I'm from. And my mother was instrumental in developing the mental health program in Barbados, the community mental health program. And as a little girl, I would get to travel with her. And I remember, little snippets of hearing her talk about the value of meeting people where they are and caring deeply for women and children who oftentimes didn't have a voice, and especially if they were mentally ill and what that meant. And then I remember as a little girl, sitting on our back patio with my dad. I was like maybe 9-ish or so, give or take. And we had these like passionate conversations about the IMF, right? Like, what did I know about the IMF at that age? And I remember saying to my father that the IMF was a problem and islands such as Barbados ought to resist the IMF, et cetera, because, there was all this talk about the IMF coming into Trinidad and Tobago, and they were in Jamaica, and there was talk about them also coming into Barbados. And my father was a very quiet soul, and I just remember him looking at me and smiling and never really uttering a word, just letting me have this rant about the injustices of the IMF and the whole nine. And so I decided that I was going to be an economist because I was going to fight the IMF, right? And protect people in Barbados from the IMF and the whole nine. And what I have come to learn eventually is that I was very intrigued by power and the exercise of power over those that didn't have the similar or equitable access to power to determine their lives. And I saw that through my mother and in my conversations with my father, and they allowed me to explore what that meant. And eventually, I kind of stumbled into Black women in politics because of that kind of background is how I ended up here. And so I oftentimes say that my interest in Black women in politics formed even before I knew what it was.
Mm. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I think our biographies are so important and relevant in terms of how we approach our scholarship, research, and activism. So, in your book, Shadow Bodies, Black Women, Ideology, Representation, and Politics, you talk a lot about power and Black women and the way that Black women's bodies are scripted. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Mhm, mhm. So a little bit about that book. So most of my prior research, I had focused on outgroup and Black women. So how groups outside of Black women respond to Black women through the use of images and symbols and how that influences public policy. And for some reason along the way, I got curious and I started wondering. And it's interesting, as I was preparing for this, I went back through some really old notebooks. And what I noticed is that I kept saying, how do Black women talk? What are Black women saying? How am I hearing Black women's voices, right? And so that gave way to this book, this curiosity around how Black women are talking about other Black women. And at the time when I kind of started playing around with this book. I was living in Maryland, and there was a really violent case of all domestic violence cases all domestic assaults are violent. But there was this particular case that resonated with me, and the woman, had gone to the court system and had pleaded with the judge to offer her an extension of the restraining order against her ex-husband.
Mm.
They were in the process of getting a divorce, and the judge mocked her, right? And basically said, "Well, I want to be 6 foot tall and be a basketball player, but everything we want can't happen." And he rejected her claim. What ended up happening was her ex-husband showed up at her place of employment. They started to have an interaction. She went outside. He doused her with gasoline and set her on fire. And at that time, I lived in Prince George's County in Maryland, which is oftentimes celebrated as the epitome of Black success, right? Because it's the one county where we have high rates of income and wealth and things like that. And so I was really intrigued by how this county was managing domestic violence. And so I looked through the records, the legislative records of the county, and I could not find anything at all. It's like, this is odd. And I started doing a little bit more digging. Come to find out that there were so very few safe homes for women who had been violated by their partners, who had experienced interpartner violence. And so I called the county, and I spoke to the lady in charge of keeping the records. And she said to me, and this resonates with me years after, she said to me, "Well, dear, you're not going to find what we're looking for, but just know that we pray about it." Prince George's County had one of the highest rates of interpartner violence in the state of Maryland, outside of Baltimore. And I'm like, we pray about it? I was like, did I hear her right? And so I said, are you meaning to tell me there's no legislation, blah, blah, blah? She goes, no, we pray about it. Thus this book. Right? Right. And so in this book, I talk about how Black women are scripted oftentimes. And I say that there are two dominant scripts. There's a script of strength, which a lot of us are familiar with, right? The strong Black woman. But it's a little bit more than just a strong Black woman. It's this notion that Black women are nurturers and et cetera. And I use literature, lots of literature, like the Book of Night Women, to talk about the supernatural Black woman, right? Because that's also another element of the strong woman script. And then I also talk a lot about this ass script, which is more than just sexuality. Sexuality is part of it. But it also has to do with this notion of belonging. And this is where these two scripts are helpful in thinking about who belongs into the public domain and therefore worthy of being protected, through public policies, etc. And so what I argue was that there are these scripts ascribed to Black women's bodies that allow them to be seen but yet not seen. So we ended up being prayed about. We see them, so we're going to pray about them. But we don't see them enough, right? Or we only see them in these very limited ways. And therefore, we determine that prayer is all they need. And so what I did was I looked at how Black women, elected officials in Congress, in Ebony and Essence, and on blogs, talk about three issues that affect Black women: interpartner violence, mental health, and HIV and AIDS. And what I argue is because of the prevalence, the use of these scripts, is that we end up not necessarily advocating on behalf of Black women, right? Or that some Black women just completely disappear from our conversations, completely disappear. So when we talk about interpartner violence, we talk about those women who have overcome, right? We love to tell those stories. When we talk about HIV and AIDS, we spend a lot of time talking about, buy lipstick for a cause, for example, or wear red bottom shoes, right? And so it's a very limited understanding of how we speak. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of Black women are disappeared in our public domain. So that's kind of what that book is about. And I think it's particularly relevant in this instance with Breonna Taylor, right? Because we see how the system, if we go back to this outgroup performance, we see how the system made her invisible, right? She was there but not there, but she was an innocent person, and you shot her, you killed her in her own home. But yet you're going to tell me that that doesn't meet the standard of some type of crime, of some type of violation of her human rights, right? So in the instant, Breonna Taylor is there, but when it comes to policy making, she completely disappears. She's completely erased.
Absolutely. And that was going to be my next question, was how can this idea of Black women's scripted bodies help us to better understand what happened to Breonna Taylor? And I think you just explained it really well. And so the news that the officers who killed her, Jonathan Mattingly, Brett Hankinson, and Miles Cosgrove, that they will not face charges in connection to her death, has devastated so many people in the Black community, especially. And so the state's political apparatus, the Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron in particular, seemed to have sided with the officers involved in the shooting. What kind of political message does this send to the Black community and to Black women in more particularly?
Mm-hmm. So, as I prepared for this conversation, I had a range of emotions, one of which is angers, right? Not just anger. And I get that from Bell Hooks, I believe, talks about the range of angers, or is it Audre Lorde, that talks about the fact that Black women exist along a plane of angers, right? And as I listened to the Attorney General, Kentucky Attorney General's kind of rationalization around his decision, I was really reminded of that night where we heard the verdict related to Trayvon Martin. And this is why I talk about angers, right? I remember I was driving. We had just recently come back from Paris, and I was driving, and a friend called me, and she said, "Julia, have you heard?" And I said, "Heard what?" She goes, "The verdict is in." And I said, "Please don't tell me, not right now, because I'm driving and I don't want to cry." I knew, I knew, right? And so I'm reminded of also those individuals who denied, or the jurors who made the claim that they couldn't distinguish Trayvon Martin's voice from that of his killer, right? And there are these parallels. There are these parallels. Well, her murder was the result of A and B and C. So we layer on these things, right? And make these claims like you couldn't distinguish Trayvon Martin's voice from his murderer's voice. Really? You really couldn't tell the difference, right? You really can't tell that she was an innocent human being laying in her own bed in the sanctity of her home, and that these individuals came in there and shot her to death and then left her, right? They left her. They walked out and left her,
Right. No.
right? Right, with no care. It was the same thing they did with Mike Brown, right? Eric Garner, right? Um, this notion of care and how we're cared for. So when I hear this question, what comes to my mind about the impact on Blackness is, where are we cared for in this process? And I oftentimes think about, my work with silence, and I don't know why I keep being drawn to silence. And particularly, in order for music to make sense, we have to have silence between the notes. Otherwise, it's just noise, right? And I read all of these moments that we've experienced with the murder, state-sanctioned violence of Black and Brown people, men and women, trans individuals, etc., children, as these moments of profound silence. But unlike music, where we need it for our ear to silence, for our ear to recognize the notes and the harmony, right? There's nothing beautiful coming from these silences. These silences are needed to maintain race gender violence, right? They're needed, like the way that the music needs silence. We need these, or not we, but some in society need these moments in order to justify and maintain the status quo, while telling us, well, we have investigated, we have had a trial, and here's an outcome. To me, the trials and the investigations are like blowing glitter in the wind, right? What's the purpose? What's the point? If you're trying to create a piece of art that needs glitter, you pour it on, you don't just blow it in the wind and let it blow off. And I think of that, Corinne Gaines, who spoke up and nobody heard her. Her utterances went into silence. Trayvon Martin's utterances went into this silence, this vacuum that exists around race gender violence in this country. And so when you ask me this question about what does this mean for Black women in particular, I see it as another avenue within which we have to fight silence, right? We have to kind of resist this politics and this practice of silence that reduces us, that tells us, like in the case of Corinne Gaines, that nobody needs to hear our voice. In the case of Sandra Bland, who spoke up, nobody has to hear her voice. Nobody's ever really been held accountable for Sandra Bland's murder. And I call it a murder. So what that means for me as a Black woman is that it brings up not just the anger of one event, but the angers that I experience across all of these events, tracing all the way back, even before I knew myself, right? So it's ancestral anger that's there, right? And I remember telling somebody, a friend of mine, that Trayvon Martin's death hit me in a way that I didn't anticipate, because, and some people might chuckle about this, but because it reminded me of somewhere in my past where I had an ancestor, or I was that woman who lost her child, because that ancestor becomes me, right? So we're not these distinct human beings as Western philosophy would lead us to believe, but where it is continuation of energy and spirit. And so for Trayvon Martin, it reminded me that at some point in time, some woman who now makes Julia Julia in this present moment had violently lost her child. And I had violently lost my child, right? And so what this means for Black women is, at least for this Black woman, is that I'm constantly being visited by sadness, by anger, by death, by mourning, right? Which has given way to what I call a hesitant hope, right? So hope becomes tempered because this is a repeated pattern in our lives. We're hopeful that our children will see something different, but we're hesitant with that hope.
Absolutely. And your conversation around silencing, I think is so profound, and it really, to me, harkens to some of the conversations that we have in Black studies, especially around histories of slavery and the slave trade and resistance, and the silences that exist within archival records of those events and processes, and the inherently violent nature of the silences of Black voices, of Black
Mhm,
women's voices,
mhm,
and how they kind of preclude us or make it unnecessarily difficult to unearth their stories, these ancestor stories, and
mhm,
their humanity.
mhm,
And it pushes us to try to be creative in terms of the way we think about approaching the archives, but it also, like you said, I think it speaks to this larger issue uh, of violence relying on the silencing of Black people and that functioning to uphold the status quo. And so
mhm,
I think it's really um, saddening and also kind of profound and important to recognize its continuation as you just
mhm,
suggested.
mhm, mhm. My daughter and I, we were having this conversation, and she said, "Mom, you ever wondered when the first Black woman saw the European on the continent of Africa, what came out of her mouth?" She was like, "What was that utterance?" Right? She goes, "You ever imagine what she said?" And she goes, "Wouldn't it be amazing to imagine that story?" And so I asked her, I said, "Why imagine, honey?" She goes, "Because there are no records." Right? She goes, "We have no record that tells us that first encounter between a Black woman and a white settler, for example. What did she say? Was she stunned? Was she silent? Did she cry out? Did she say welcome in whatever language, whatever tongue? So we've been playing around a little bit with imagining our voices, and I think that she needs that exercise in order to ground her and recognize the continuity of Black women's voices through time, even though it doesn't formally exist in the archives.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of imagining possibilities, I think, is so critical, especially at the historical juncture in which we live right now in
Mhm,
2020. So if we can, let's shift gears a little bit
mhm,
to talk about the fact that we are in the midst of one of the most contested presidential elections in recent history, at least. And issues of race and gender are at the core of debates about the Supreme Court nomination, about political representation within the Democratic Party, and the ways Democrats need to mobilize their base, primarily Black folks, to ensure a strong voter turnout, all in the midst of a global pandemic, right? And so we're kind of at this crossroads of um, a shifting political and economic order in which Black folks and Black women in particular are pushing the envelope in terms of imagining these new possibilities. And we see an example of that with Kamala Harris, right? So all over the country, Black women have especially celebrated the Democratic nomination of Kamala Harris for vice president, which would possibly make her the first Black and Indian American and woman to occupy that position. What significance, if any, does this type of racial and gender representation have? And what are some limitations, if any, are there to emphasizing representation at the expense, perhaps, of substantive, transformative, and political agendas for the Black community?
mhm, mhm. So, of course, I understand theoretically and emotionally why um, VP-elect Harris raises, a kind of emotion among Black folk, women, those of us on the margin, right? Because of what she embodies. She embodies um, so much in her social location, whether it's Blackness, South Asian identity. womanness, etc. And for me, also, I add in there this immigrant background, right? And what that means. Because her immigrant background is so close to her existence. So this is an immigrant background from years and years ago, where you've had X number of people now become American citizens. We're talking about an immigrant background with her parents, right? And her being the first generation born here. And I think that that matters just as much as, just as much as her being um, Black, South Asian, and woman. And so that signals a kind of opening, a possibility of an opening, even if it's just symbolic and not substantive. We wouldn't know if it's going to be substantive until, they're elected. But symbolically, it signals a type of opening of the Democratic Party, a kind of recognition of who the Democratic base is, right? And the fact that you can't continue to overlook this base. So Black women have consistently outvoted most other demographic groups for the Democratic Party, right? Beyond that, Black women are overwhelmingly running on Democratic tickets. So at some point, the Democratic Party, if it's savvy enough in making these calculations, and rest assured, this is a calculation, right, for the Democratic Party. That doesn't mean it's corrupt and vile and all this stuff, but it's a calculation, political calculation. And so it behoves the Democratic Party to make this kind of decision if it wants to expand its base. Because right now what's happening is the parties are kind of fighting for people on the margins, right? And so this nomination becomes important for thinking about how to expand the base. And if we think about politics as an exchange, so you vote for me, we give you policies, etc. We reward you in a particular way, then one could argue that Black women are deserving of this reward. I know that sounds a little corrupt and violent. Oh my God, it's tick for tat, but it's politics, let's be honest, right? Many decisions going on here that aren't calculated short term and long term, right? So let's not pretend. I oftentimes tell people this is not a love affair, okay? This is practical politics. But more importantly, VP-elect Harris is a moderate at the end of the day. And people are, I think, ignoring that because we're caught up with the symbolism of her identity. But politically, she's a moderate. And that matters, right? Because it matters in terms of what policies she might advocate for, but it also matters in terms of signaling to particular populations of the Democratic Party that we might select this person, but you don't have to worry because they're safe, because she's a moderate, right? And in fact, I call Senator Harris a new Democrat, which is a term that has kind of gone out of existence with President Clinton. But if you look at a lot of her policy suggestions, outside of when she started to gear up to run for office, you would see that a lot of her politics mirrors this notion of a new Democrat, which is this kind of folding in of what we think about as progressive politics into the Democratic Party, right? And that I'm a little cautious about what that means in terms of substance. So symbolically, I celebrate just like everybody else. In terms of substance, I have question marks. Because if in fact she's a new Democrat, what has happened with new Democrats is that policy has ended up punishing. So you think of what we refer to as welfare reform, or even crime policies that came out of the Clinton era, and to some extent carried over in the Obama era, right? Obama was not necessarily radical either. But I argue, and I remember arguing this when he was first elected, and people looked at me like that's crazy. I said he's pretty conservative. I'm like, look at his fatherhood promotion policies, right? Just look at his fatherhood promotion policies. Black women disappeared. So if we look at the history of what comes out of the new Democrat agenda, and Joe Biden is one of those, I'm not convinced of seeing any kind of what might be termed progressive politics. Incremental policy changes, yes. Radical changes, no. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Did I?
No, I think that's great, and it does kind of fold into the next question I had, but it does speak to this kind of seeming willingness on the part of the Democratic Party to capitulate and appease the more kind of right wing Republican conservative base with policies that either inadvertently or intentionally target and undermine Black communities. And
Mhm.
one of the areas in which VP-elect Kamala Harris is probably most critiqued, at least from what I see, is within her criminal justice record while she served as a district attorney and later as the Attorney General of California. Um, in which Black women were kind of disproportionately impacted by those policies, and even in some cases jailed for incidences that I think most people would consider to be trivial, especially considering the issues relating to child truancy laws. Right?
Mhm.
So do you think that some of these criticisms of her record are rooted in anti-Blackness, misogyny, and even anti-immigrant sentiment, which you spoke to, or are they speaking to valid concerns about the policies of mainstream Democrats, or what you would call New Democrats?
Right, right. So I think it's probably a bit of both because the fact that she is Black and woman is always going to factor into people's response to her, whether it's implicitly or explicitly recognized, right? So this notion that she was like too ambitious or whatever, that is very raced and gendered, and also has some immigrant status, kind of like know your place, and you can't be too ambitious as a woman of color, coming from that immigrant background. So I think that the response to her policies, for some people, not for everybody, there is that element. And we can determine if that's part of that element by sometimes looking at the framing of the response to her policies. But I also think that there are some legitimate concerns being raised, right? And so in her role as Attorney General, as she worked her way through the ranks in California, I think she has a bit of a mixed record when it comes to criminal justice reform. And you mentioned the truancy approach that she took, which ended up, causing some harm, to say the least. And I oftentimes tell students this, that Black women are among the fastest growing prison population in this country. And so when we think about justice, the reform of of the criminal justice system, we ought to think about it from a gendered perspective, right? And so when I look at her policies through a lens of race, gender, class, etc., what I see is a kind of maintenance of a particular understanding of Blackness that warrants critique, that has less to do with her identity, but we can't always neatly separate out identity. And so what I see with some of her policies is this notion of the respectability politics. All right. Now I separate out, VP-elect Harris from Attorney General, et cetera, or even early Senator Harris, right? Because now we're seeing the switch where she is kind of bringing from the margins to the center the impact of policies on Black women. And hopefully that will continue. And she will be able to make some types of strides, for example, with Black infant mortality rates and things of that nature. But I do think that we have to be very careful of thinking about how these critiques are occurring And I know it sounds contradictory because on the one hand, I said some critiques are valid because they're not necessarily grounded in her identity. But I also say it's very hard to issue these critiques without thinking of her identity and how we might subconsciously respond to the political behaviors of somebody who is simultaneously Black, South Asian, of an immigrant background, and who's a woman. So I don't know if that makes sense, right? Because it's not that easy. It's really, truly not that easy. And I remember years ago, I did a talk and I said, I'm going to stand up here and what do you see? You see a Black woman. I'm going to turn around and what do you see? You're still going to see a Black woman. Regardless of what angle you look at me through, you're going to see me through the lens of both Blackness and womanness. And you can't avoid that with VP-elect Harris.
Absolutely. And I think that, we hopefully have, like you said, already begun to see kind of hints of more progressive ideas coming from her, as well as the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, that hopefully portend that when and if they take office in 2021, that there will be policies and ideas and practices put in place that are more broadly embracing the perspectives of Black folks, of poor folks, of women, Latino folks, women of color in general, and immigrants as well. And we can also begin to hope that with the changing administration and changing Congress, that perhaps, even though we can't necessarily 100% link policy to identity, that there can be a certain degree to which we can begin to hope and assume that the presence of more Black people and Black women in particular in government will lead to more progressive outcomes, which leads to my next question, which you touched on very briefly a few minutes ago, which is that recent research shows that there has been a huge increase of Black women candidates for U.S. congressional seats within the past 5 to 6 years. So what do you think is behind this engagement with electoral politics, and what kind of message does that send?
I think it's kind of simple. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired.
There you go.
Right? So, like I think about Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon Martin's mother, who recently ran for elected office and lost by less than 1%. Or I think about, what's her name? Jordan Davis's mother, Lucy Macbeth, who actually won in Georgia. Right? And I think about the pain that these women experience having to bury their sons, and then taking that pain and deciding that they can have influence within a system that resulted in them having to bury their children. And I don't think that people understand fully that when Black women decide to participate in a political structure, it oftentimes comes from a place of pain, direct or indirect, right? Which is different from how, for example, white men get into politics, right? We come from personal experience, deeply personal experience. Again, either direct or indirect experience. So school systems not responding to our children, right? Healthcare structures not responding. Breonna Taylor's kind of decisions, so criminal justice systems not responding. And so it's no surprise that in the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen this uptake in Black women running for political office because we're holding a lot of pain. Again, it's that hesitant hope, right? So we're thinking that we can't just hold a pain, we have to do something with that pain. And again, I come back to Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, they talk about anger as not a bad place to exist in, but a place that can lead us towards social justice if harnessed properly. And so I write about Black women's anger, right? And how it propels us to action oftentimes. if we choose, because there are moments where the anger is so intense we can't get beyond it. But at moments we get beyond it. And so, and not get beyond it, but we're able to allow anger to rest in a particular place in our lives so that we can get to a particular kind of action. And I see this happening with Black women and why they're running for office, right? Is because we are enduring so much, and the ghost of all these people are haunting us and telling us, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? Right? So I think it's also a response to not just the anger that we're experiencing in the here and now, but that long ancestral anger that we've experienced is giving birth to Black women in particular wanting to do this kind of work. Like I think of Ida B. Wells Barnett, right? Who said, I'm going to chronicle this so that you, the United States, can never walk away from your history, right? Or I think of Satima Clark, who helped to found the Highland School and these schools around political literacy, right?
I was thinking of Fannie Lou Hamer and her
Yeah.
Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, and how her story and personal pain of coming from a sharecropping background and violence from the police influenced her activism around voting rights.
Hmm. And so I mentioned all of those people to say, don't just look at what's happening in the here and now without a historical context of how Black women protest, right?
Absolutely.
Protest by running for office. We protest by speaking and inserting our voices when we're told to be silent. Right? That's also political. And so I just think that, a lot of what we're seeing is coming from a place of anger, of pain, and a notion of hesitant hope.
Mhm. Absolutely. So in your book Shadow Bodies, you talk a lot about Black women's alternate political practices, and recently we hear a lot about self-care as a political act. Tell us a little bit more about what that means and how it fits within this broader framework of Black women's political action.
Mhm, mhm. So I think that they are various notions of self care that exist. And sometimes when I'm on Twitter and stuff, you see, Black Girl Joy, and I'm doing this for self-care and getting my nails done and all this stuff. And I smile because I think, and this is not to condemn people, people ought to do whatever they want to do that makes them feel good. But that's also a very capitalist understanding of self-care. And don't get me wrong, I love pretty toenails. I'm not saying that they don't play a role. They do. But I don't think that that's what Audre Lorde is talking about. And she's oftentimes cited, right? If you go back and you read Audre Lorde's work, Audre Lorde, when she talks about self-care, she talks a lot about being in community, right? Resting in community and sharing, right? Which goes against this very individualistic understanding of self-care that we're seeing kind of advocated for. But she also talks about how community becomes a part of the political work, right? Because it becomes political, to go back to where I started, because it renders those of us who politics and practices oftentimes make invisible. It allows us to put down those scripts that force us into this place of being shadow bodies, right? And she goes, that's political. And let me come to a little bit of Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks and Sisters of the Yam, even though she doesn't name this as self-care, offers us a very political understanding of self-care. And she poses this question and she says, where do Black women, and I'm paraphrasing, but where do Black women go to heal? Self-care has to be about healing from race gender trauma, has to be about healing from race gender violence. Where do you do that? In community. Community is the exact opposite of the American ethos. And that's what becomes radical, because the American ethos is grounded in individualism. Self-care for Audre Lorde, in part, not totally, there's a whole lot we could talk about with self-care and Audre Lorde, is grounded in community.
Thank you
Okay?
for that. Yeah, that's absolutely kind of opposed or in contrast to, the types of ways that we think about self-care kind of colloquially, even not necessarily in terms of participating in kind of capitalist friendly self-care, but even, introspection and um, biography, which I think is important. Um, but for what to do with it, right? What do we do once that kind of internal work is done? How do we then share those things and continue to help to heal one another in different spaces? So I think that's really important.
Mhm.
So do you have any last takeaway messages for us that would help us kind of grapple with the days ahead? It seems like, every week in 2020 has been another kind of devastating, shocking, but maybe not so shocking, saddening, angering headline. So especially with this upcoming election, what can you share with us?
You know, I often find myself coming back to this notion of being grounded, right? And if 2020, and I don't want to put this on a year because 2020 as a year has not done a thing to us, right? um,
The calendar didn't do anything.
right, right, exactly. So why blame the calendar?
Yeah.
Um, what has occurred in 2020 from you've listed them all. And so for me, again, on a very personal level, is this notion of being grounded in truth, right? And to truth for me is my self-care, always operating from a position of truth. And I keep telling folks, do not let the anxiety of the institution become your anxiety. Recognize that the institutions have the right to their own anxiety, but you need not allow it to be yours. And how do you not allow it to be yours? You come back to being grounded in your truth, which requires deep, deep self reflection and honesty, not with anybody else, but with you, right? And I think that's how we kind of allow ourselves the space, the grace, everything that we need in order to not become overwhelmed by all we're experiencing, right? And then I oftentimes say, participate at a level that is comfortable for you. And for me, that, get involved in some type of community that allows your humanity to be recognized in a way that reaffirms you and allows for your self articulation so that you can then give space to other people so that they can engage in their own self articulation, right? But be grounded in your understanding of your humanity and find those spaces where you can exist and your humanity can exist and be nurtured and be cared for. And then finally, what I would say is do the research that you need to do in order for you to make informed decisions. So do the research on why wearing a mask is important, and more importantly, how to wear a mask. Do the research on who to vote for, and don't be swayed by people's definitions or people's constructions of who is good for you and who's not good for you. All right. But really invest in knowledge of yourself, knowledge of society, knowledge of your community, and make those informed decisions. And then you're going to, because you're going to know that you're grounded in who you are.
Absolutely. So we all have our instructions to to lean into ourselves and lean into others. It sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really great talk, Julia. I'm so glad we were able to connect to have this discussion. Um, I love your background art, by the way. It's so apropos, I think.
And I do have to give credit to the Museum of the African Diaspora. This is their art. This is their background. A
Awesome.
lovely space. So once COVID lets us back out, I encourage people to go look at it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And we look forward to the next episode of Justice in All Black. So have a great day, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Yes. Thank you and be well. Take good care of you, okay?
Thanks. You too, Julia. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Niña de fuego para llevar.